Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this kind invitation to address the American Educational Research Association. And I love your theme this year, Toward Justice, Culture, Language, Heritage, and Education, Research, and Practice. And our congratulations to President Joyce King. I bring you greetings and thanks from the staff of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Through your tax dollars, you have already contributed half of the construction costs, $270 million. Thank you so much. We are the Smithsonian's 19th museum, currently under construction at the base of the Washington Monument. Our director, Lonnie Bunch, the former director of the Chicago History Museum, formerly the Chicago Historical Society, he's in Chicago today meeting with our board member, Oprah Winfrey, our most generous donor to date. She's given us $13 million. This museum was the dream of our colored Civil War veterans, who began asking for the creation of this museum early in the last century. The late Congressman Mickey Leland picked up the torch, and then Congressman John Lewis introduced legislation to authorize the museum for many years. President George W. Bush convened a convention made up of his appointees and those by the House and the Senate. And they recommended in 2003 that the National Museum of African American History and Culture be created under the auspices of the Smithsonian, that we then hire a director, undertake feasibility studies of 5 potential sites on or near the National Mall, begin to hire staff, and raise the other half of the construction costs from individuals, corporations, and foundations. I've worked on this project for the past 10 years. When we study American history, we usually begin with the British are coming. However, if your intention is to understand the history of Africans arriving in the United States, you must learn who brought Africans when to what now constitutes the United States. Unfortunately, this history has been hidden and obscured. I learned it at home and through my own travels and study, not in school and not at the university. While we will soon hear plans to commemorate the first landing of enslaved Africans in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, Africans were here a century earlier than that. We will not discuss the merits at this time of Ivan Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus. Suffice it to say that the Spanish brought the first Africans, and the first were free. Africans arrived in Florida with the Spanish in 1506, in Puerto Rico in 1508, in Jamaica in 1509, in Cuba in 1511. The British bring Africans to Nova Scotia in 1605. The Dutch bring those Africans to Jamestown and the New Netherlands in 1619, including to New Amsterdam. The Danish bring Africans to the Virgin Islands beginning in 1673. The French bring Africans to Louisiana beginning in 1719. They were trying to grow potatoes. Potatoes still don't grow in Louisiana. So they brought Africans who knew how to grow rice, and they had a first harvest and the end of starvation in 1720. These travels, this trade was organized by royal trading companies, and the wealth goes to investors and the royal families. I went to school in England when I was 10, and we studied the Elizabethan period. And from that moment on, Queen Elizabeth I was my favorite queen until I learned the fortune she gained from the slave trade. Emancipation in the United States was not just April 16th, today, 1862, when the first slaves were freed in Washington, D.C. by President Lincoln. Then the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. And then in Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas in 1865. The North has been in denial about slavery until 1991, when the African burial ground was discovered during the construction of a new federal office building near Wall Street. Indeed, it is the Africans who built the wall for whom Wall Street is named. 20,000 are buried there in a cemetery that was closed before the American Revolution. Rhode Island had 23 rum distilleries with sugar from the South and Cuba. Vermont frees its enslaved people in 1777. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts free their enslaved populations through gradual emancipation in 1780. Gradual emancipation means that males only become free when they reach the age of 28. Females become free when they turn 25. New Hampshire frees its slaves in 1783. Connecticut in 1784, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. Many of these latter were also gradual emancipation. Now, who supplied the cotton to New England's textile mills? So how does one create a national museum that incorporates these perspectives? Remember that museums are research-based institutions. The first African-American museum was created at Hampton University in 1868. Its arts faculty produced works, collected Henry O. Tanner's paintings, and those created by the university's own students. Professor Shepard went to the Congo in the 1880s and brought back artifacts. Native American students at Hampton added to the museum's collections. In the 20th century, concerned citizens, noting that our city, state, and national museums ignored or minimalized the role of African Americans in shaping the United States, created their own collections of photographs, artifacts, and stories in their homes, and established new institutions across the country. Similarly, communities of African descent elsewhere in the hemisphere, noting that their national and state and provincial museums ignored the African role, were forced to create parallel institutions. As a staff in 2005, we had a board responsible for governance and fundraising. Also established was the Scholarly Advisory Committee, chaired by my late father, John Hope Franklin. Joining him were physical and cultural anthropologists, historians, legal scholars, and scholars of music and art. They assure that our curators have access to the best scholarship to inform our exhibitions. Each exhibition, each of our dozen exhibitions, has its own scholarly advisory committee. Now, what was to be in this building? As a small staff, we developed a program document in consultation with many advisors to determine how many galleries, theaters, libraries, and restaurants would be in this facility. We determined that we would need at least a dozen galleries. This 2-volume document was then made available to the 23 architectural firms that bid on the project. Our board recommended that the best site was bordered by 14th and 15th Street in downtown Washington, Constitution Avenue, and Madison Drive at the base of the Washington Monument. This would be just next to the White House, the Museum of American History, the Holocaust Museum, and the Bureau of Engraving. And because of this location, we estimate that our museum will receive 3 to 4 million visitors a year when we open in late 2016. My father would have been 100 this year, and he reshaped our view of American history and Southern history, and how essential it is to understanding U.S. history. He taught at Howard University, from 1947, when he published From Slavery to Freedom, until 1956. After this session, there are a number of these copies of these maps up here in front, if you'd like. They're not enough for the whole audience, but they're about 100. Our knowledge is truly based on the knowledge of those who precede us. So my father taught Joseph Harris, who's now in his late 80s, at Howard in the early 1950s. And Joseph Harris created this Africa Diaspora Map, looking at the period up till 1873. You'll notice on the right-hand side of the map, the arrows take you into the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. We don't generally think about the slave trade in the Indian Ocean basin and the Persian Gulf, but this goes back 1,500 years. You'll also notice arrows within the continent going to the north, taking people across the Sahara into North Africa, and from deep inland in East Africa, bringing people to the coast, and in West Africa, taking people from inland to the west coast. We're more familiar with the left side of the map, with all of the Africans coming to different parts of the Americas. For those of you who are closer, you can see that the arrow goes across Panama before the canal is constructed. Africans were used to carry goods across Panama to ships waiting on either side of the isthmus. What we don't get from this map is the volume of people. So 20 years later, in 2010, David Eltis and David Richardson create a 189 map book called The Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And because this is big business, because this is the first globalization, we have financial records. I've been in the French municipal archives where individual cities sent ships into the slave trade, and they counted every piece of pottery they sent, every bottle of wine they sent, the textiles, the guns, the ammunition, the lead, the pewter, the enamel, on these ships down the West African coast, floating Walmart. Then the ships become floating prisons with these 12.5 million people taken from Africa to all of these places in the Americas. Now, that's why I want you to come and get copies of the map when you can, because the figures are astounding. You see how few people go to North America. 5% of the Africans coming in the transatlantic slave trade come to North America, and primarily to 4 ports: Providence, Rhode Island, Baltimore, Maryland, Charleston, South Carolina, and the area we now call New Orleans. More than that go to Barbados alone. 1 million to Jamaica, 1 million to Haiti, 1 million to Cuba, 6 million to Brazil. And look at how many hundreds of thousands and millions are taken into North Africa, across the Sahara, 1 million from Sudan into Libya, 800,000 from Somalia into Saudi, hundreds of thousands into the Indian Ocean to populate the French islands where they grow sugar in Réunion, Seychelles, Mauritius, Madagascar. And you see how many go to Brazil. Because this is a formal system of slavery, each country had a formal emancipation date. So every country in the hemisphere, including Canada, has different emancipation dates, and we fit in the middle of that in the 1860s. You'll see that Haiti is the first in 1793, followed in quick succession by all the Central American countries in the 1820s. Britain frees its enslaved people in 1833, so whether it's Canada, Bahamas, Trinidad, former British Honduras, which you know as Belize, Trinidad, Tobago, Grenada, all of those countries free their slaves in 1833. France, unfortunately, frees their slaves twice. The French Revolution frees them in 1789. Then Napoleon, thanks to his wife, Empress Josephine, re-enslaves Africans in 1802. So slavery does not end in France or in French territories until 1848. Brazil is the last in 1888, and Cuba is just behind it in 1886. The last country actually on the planet to abolish slavery is Mauritania in 1981. And I was living in Senegal at the time when those people were freed. Now, Washington, D.C. is our third national capital, following New York and Philadelphia. And this is a map of Washington in 1792, when the decision was being made to create a federal city, like Abuja in Nigeria or Brasilia in Brazil. But at that point, it was plantations, and here you have the names of the plantations and the names of the owners who are compensated by the federal government for their land. In the center, those of you can see close, you see something marked Jenkins Hill. That becomes Capitol Hill. And to the left of it, there's something called Goose or Tiber Creek, which is actually underneath Constitution Avenue and underneath our building currently under construction. You'll note that Georgetown already existed as a separate city in 1792. The museum, as you heard earlier, is the 19th museum. The cost was initially $500 million. Now it's up to $540. We're going to be the first green building on the mall. We're seeking LEED Gold certification. We broke ground, and you'll see an excerpt from the groundbreaking a little later, in February 2012, and we hope to open in late 16. President Obama wants to cut the ribbon. We have a very distinguished board chaired by Dick Parsons and Linda Johnson Rice right here in Chicago. This is the members of the Scholarly Advisory Committee. My father, as I said, was the former chair. The building itself is 40% underground. Washington has height restrictions. We're next to the White House. We're next to American history. So we put 40% of the building below ground, and that will include our history galleries, which are divided in from Africa with all the knowledge and skills brought to the end of the Civil War in the first phase. The second phase is from Reconstruction to 1968, Martin Luther King's assassination. And the third contemporary section is from 1968 to President Obama's first inauguration. You will enter on the ground floor where we have our orientation theater, our wayfinding. The second floor is the learning floor with 3 classrooms, what used to be called the Library and Archives, which we're calling an Information Commons, a youth gallery, and our Center for African American Media Arts. The third floor is our floor on community with military history, sports history, the history of the organizations and institutions we created in an exhibition called Making a Way Out of No Way, and an exhibition called The Power of Place on place-specific and time-specific stories. The fourth floor is the floor for culture with musical crossroads, taking it to the stage, looking at theater, comedy, and dance. Visual arts, a traveling visual arts gallery, changing gallery, and cultural expressions that look at the use of language, craft, cuisine. It should be a very exciting space. The fifth floor is for staff and our board. We're so close to the White House that, of course, on one side you can't look out over the White House for security reasons. Collecting artifacts occurs after you decide what stories you're going to tell. We felt that this museum, for all visitors, needed to be rooted in history. And of course, the older the pieces are, the more difficult they are to find. So the pieces of the slavery era were quite challenging. In the upper right-hand corner, you have a gunpowder horn from the Revolutionary War, scrimshaw. It's written on the whale tusk. We acquired 39 pieces belonging to or associated with Harriet Tubman from the scholar Charles Blockson. He inherited from his aunt these 39 pieces that include her hymnal, her fork and knife, a lace collar, a handkerchief, and a scarf, a shawl that Queen Victoria bestowed on Harriet Tubman. Any good museum on African American history has to have some Klan materials. So we have some authentic Klan materials. And our largest artifact is that Southern Segregated Railways car from the 1940s, which was lowered into our construction site in November of 13, alongside the guard tower from the Angola prison in Louisiana. We have a prison cell. So we're dealing with incarceration from the 19th century right up until the present. In our community galleries, we have the Tuskegee Airmen training plane. We have materials from various sports figures and various phases of our military history, as well as from the fraternities and sororities, political organizations, social organizations, colleges and universities, and schools that have been created both during slavery, segregation, and beyond. In our culture galleries, we have represented here in the upper right-hand corner, sculpture by Elizabeth Catlett. We acquired the entire collection of the Black Fashion Museum in New York. It was in Harlem, and it includes everything from slave-era clothing through costumes from Black Broadway musicals such as The Wiz. That's Louis Armstrong's trumpet on the right, and some renderings by our graphic designers and designers of what those galleries will look like. Every museum has to have iconic objects. In this case, on the far left, you have a document selling a young girl into slavery. The top center, the right is Harriet Tubman's hymnal. And the bottom you have the slave cabin we collected in Edisto Island. I'm trying to remember whose Bible this is. It'll come to me. When Rosa Parks was arrested, she was carrying a dress. She was a seamstress as well. That's the dress she had on the left. We tried to buy Michael Jackson's glove. It went for $750,000. So we have a fedora. We have some of his clothing, but we didn't get the glove. And then on the right, you have shards from the church in Birmingham where the 4 little girls are killed, the 16th Baptist Church. This is the railroad car, which we fully restored in Kentucky and brought by flatbed truck to Washington. 1/4 for African Americans with separate facilities, 3/4 for whites with separate facilities. The visitors will actually have the opportunity to go into this rail car. Unlike most of our sister museums in the Smithsonian, we decided to operate both before we had a building and outside of Washington. So we've had activities here in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Houston, in Dallas, on the West Coast, in Seattle, and of course in Washington. We also decided not to wait to have a building to show our value to the nation. So we have a program initially funded by the Bank of America and now by the Kellogg Foundation called Save Our African American Treasures. And all of us, of all backgrounds, may have African American treasures in our possession, be it a baseball or a recording or books and other objects precious from the past. We have a classroom version of this so that we teach young people the value of the things in their home. Things in your homes have stories, and you need to learn the stories from your grandparents and parents so that you're able to pass that knowledge on from generation to generation. At our construction site, we have a welcome center so visitors can understand the construction process. Now, we have 2 cameras strategically located to document the construction of this building. This is taken from the top of the Washington Monument, looking down into our construction site about 2 years ago. You see how large that hole is. That's 35,000 truckloads of dirt. It's 80 feet deep. It's a 5.5 acre site. And we built the entire below ground construction to fill up that 5.5 acres. And then from the center of that, a building rises. The upper right-hand corner is the American History Museum, and immediately north of the building is the Department of Commerce. The White House is off the screen to your left. So we build a building with 4 central columns, 18 hours a day. This is the day we lower with special cranes the railroad car right above the words house and White House there. You can see the top of the railroad car. And on the right-hand side is the top of the guard tower from Angola Prison being lowered into the construction site. The railroad car then has to be protected against the rest of the construction, so that oblong structure surrounded by plywood is the railroad car. And behind it is that guard tower. This white square you see in the center is what we call the Contemplative Court. We think this will be a very powerful and moving experience for everyone. And we want a place where we plan for you to be able to reflect and talk to people you came with, as well as people you are meeting for the first time, about what this experience has been for you. So that 5.5 acre site is then covered with steel beams and concrete, and then we begin the above ground construction. And it looks like an erector set going up. This is our second camera from the roof of American History. That's the Washington Monument on your far left. Then we build these 4 columns of concrete for our elevators: freight elevator, staff elevator, and elevator for personnel, for visitors. Then we cloak the building in steel. And from those steel girders will hang 3,600 bronze panels. Now, the shape of the building is inspired by a Yoruba veranda post with 3 notches. And the skin of the building comes from the work and is inspired by the work of the blacksmiths in Charleston and New Orleans. You'll see at the very end of this the first panels, which were hung on Tuesday. Now we're building 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The building is almost completely glazed. And in the bottom left-hand corner of the building, you see that first set of bronze panels. This was Tuesday, so this is a milestone for us, and over the next year, the rest of the 3,600 bronze panels will be hung. This is, again, a view underground of our construction site. This is the history gallery, which is tiered, and the circle that you see at the very top of the screen is what we call the oculus, where water will cascade down into the Contemplative Court. This wall to your left faces all 3 history galleries. And because our mission is to show American history and culture through an African-American lens, the founding documents of America will be on that wall. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They will all be in view, in plain view, from anywhere you are in the history galleries. This is a rendering at the upper left-hand corner of what that oculus will be, and then the other three are actual construction photos. This is the mock-up that we did of how the panels will hang before we actually began to hang them this week. You can give as much money as you want. We still need $60 million, so we're collecting all times. You can go to our website, you can drive up to us, you can give us money, however you'd like to do. We have a very distinguished group of donors. The Smithsonian asked, where did you find all these $1 million donors? But you can become a member for as little as $25. We're at 73,000 members. We hope to get to 100,000 members by the time we open. Now, the next section I want to frame by a poem. I wrote this 10 years ago. A photographer took a number of images of people on plantations in the 20th century in color, and he had them clothed in period costumes, black and white men and women. He showed me the entire collection, which he called Plantation Lullaby, and asked me to write something for the catalog. I thought it was going to come out in prose. It came out like this. Our ancestors. Where our ancestors lived, we live. Where our ancestors walked, we walk. Where they traveled the Middle Passage, we cruise. Where they offloaded from Baltimore Clippers, we dine. Where they marched in shackles, we legislate. Where our ancestors were sold, we work. Where they toiled in the fields, we garden. Where they worked in their owner's house, we tour. Where they fished, we fish. Where our ancestors raised their children, we raise ours. Where they were punished, we are punished. Where they mourned, we mourn. Where they worshiped, we worship. Where they rejoice, we rejoice. Where they resisted, we too resist. Where they sought justice, we seek justice. Where ancestors escaped, we drive. Where ancestors walk, we walk. Where ancestors lived, we live. Thank you. Now, I work at the Smithsonian, which is a 19th century institution. Who do you think quarried the stones in 1847 for the Smithsonian headquarters building? Well, I had always assumed that since the slave markets were near where the construction site of the castle is, that it was unlikely that it was free labor. Indeed, it's a colleague, Mark Oslander, who teaches at Central Washington University, who discovered that the people who quarried the stones for the Smithsonian Castle were the descendants of Martha Custis Washington slaves. Now, you must remember that Martha Washington was married before she married George. And as a young white aristocratic woman, she was given slaves as a child to raise her. Then, when Custis dies, she inherits his slaves and brings them into the marriage with George. So Mount Vernon, to a great extent, is populated by slaves owned by Martha when she moves into Mount Vernon. Mark Oslander has also studied the records, which are all in the National Archives, of who was hired to build the castle. And you could always tell when someone had 2 boys at $2 a day that they were enslaved people brought onto the castle construction site to work. I mention this because so many of our 19th century institutions are influenced and shaped by slavery, we don't think about that. Even the money from Mr. James Smithson, a British scientist. Where do most British 19th century fortunes come from? Sugar, and therefore associated with slavery. So even the $500,000 that he gives the United States government to create an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge is tainted by slavery. Now, our universities, unfortunately, are similarly tainted. Tomorrow, Stephen Craig Wilder is here. He's on a panel, but he's not speaking about this book that he published, Ebony and Ivy, in 2013. I recommend it to all of you to understand the history of all of our earliest universities. Because be it Harvard in 1636, Yale in 1701, Rutgers and Penn, Columbia, Dartmouth, UVA, William and Mary, the list is very long. They're all built by slaves, staffed by slave labor. The food that is grown, the livestock that is raised and then slaughtered and then cooked is all prepared by enslaved people. They do not benefit from this education. And those early students bring their slaves with them. I first learned about this when I was talking to someone from UVA, an archivist who'd studied the earliest records, and you could tell the wealth of the students by how many slaves accompanied them to university. The wealthiest had 8 to 10. President Teresa Sullivan has just hosted a conference this fall called Universities Confronting the Legacy of Slavery. Most universities will not discuss this period. There are labor issues. They fear lawsuits. But we need to know the history of these institutions. Not only did the Dutch merchants stay in New York after it became a British colony, they sent their students to these universities. The faculty owned slaves. The presidents owned slaves. The first endowment that Harvard received was from a plantation owner. And then they began to recruit students from the Caribbean, sons of wealthy planters. Don't go to Oxford. Don't go to Cambridge. Come to Princeton. Come to Dartmouth. And they come with their fortunes. And then their bequests go to these universities, and the universities end up owning plantations, which they lease. And they rent out slaves. And one of the most harrowing components of this book is that all of the medical schools use Indians and African Americans' cadavers to experiment on. So all the dissections are done with these people of color. So our universities need to know their histories and their implications for the present. Now, I ask you, as you travel the nation and the world, you take the time to learn about the places where these different histories are located and housed. I'm going to give you a couple of recent examples in the last couple of weeks. I was in Charleston 2 weeks ago. I was in Charleston the 29th, 30th, and 31st of March. I visited the Slave Mart. I'd read about it for years. But only when I went in the Slave Mart did I realize that the Slave Mart was built when the law was passed in Charleston to force people to sell their slaves, no longer sell their slaves in the street, but sell them indoors. So they had to create places for these sales. The staff there told me, of the many plantations you can visit in Charleston, go to Boone Hall because it had the best interpretation of the African American experience. It has 9 brick homes, dwellings that enslaved people lived in. And each building interprets a different aspect of the enslaved experience. I went to the Avery Institute because, like most southern cities, high schools were segregated, and this was a school for black students in Charleston. Then I went to Richmond, and Richmond has its own slave trail. And you can walk from where the Africans are offloaded onto the ships to where they're sold in downtown Richmond. There are over 100 merchants selling enslaved people. How many of you saw 12 Years a Slave? Well, he went from a building that was in front of my office building to a slave pen in Richmond and then a slave pen in New Orleans. And in his book, published in 1853, which was a bestseller in the 1850s, he describes in detail what it was like to be in each of those slave pens. It's not fiction, it's his eyewitness account of what the experience was like. That was Nat Turner's Bible, by the way. It came to me later, sorry. Now, Saturday I'm going to Montpelier, which is where James Madison had his plantation, wrote the Constitution. But he has enslaved people, and now we have, last year, had the 3rd convening of the descendants of the enslaved community from Montpelier. And David Rubenstein, who's been extremely generous to the nation, helped repair the Washington Monument, the National Cathedral in Washington from earthquake damage. He's given $13 million to Duke's Library, where my father's papers are held. And now he's just given $10 million to Montpelier, which will enable them to interpret, among other things, the life of the enslaved. And so they're breaking ground Saturday on the South Yard, where they will reconstruct some slave dwellings. And I'll be there to witness that. You're here in Chicago, so if you have time and are down near the University of Chicago, go to the DuSable Museum and learn about Chicago and Illinois. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about my family on my father's side. My mother's side, I asked my oldest cousin on my mother's side, what's our story of enslavement and freedom? And Judith Carroll said, well, as far back as she's researched, we've been free to 1760. But on my father's side, it's a much more grim story. We're enslaved by Chickasaw Indians and get to Oklahoma through the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Now, in 1830, the American Indian Removal Act is passed, freeing up 7 million acres for white farmers. And the Indians from the southeast part of the United States are forced to walk to what is viewed then as worthless land called Indian Territory. So the blacks and Indians get there first, before white people. The family that owned us was named the Birneys, B-U-R-N-E-Y, B-I-R-N-E-Y. And my great-great-grandfather runs away from them. My family are black ranchers and black cowboys. We don't see that depicted in our films, but they were. And they took their livestock to Kansas and Colorado to market. So my grandfather is the first, so my great-grandfather runs away, fights in the Union forces, and changes his name to Franklin. So we've only been Franklins for the last 150 years. My grandfather, a middle child of 8, is the only one and first to go to college, and he goes to Roger Williams University in the fall of 1899 in Nashville, Tennessee. And that's where he meets Molly Parker, my grandmother-to-be, from Jed, Mississippi. And what do college students do during the summer? They seek work. So, in the spring, late spring of 1900, he comes to Chicago by train. He works his way up on the railroad as a Pullman porter, and this is what he wrote. The following morning, we left for Chicago. We came into the city at the old Polk Street Depot. We'd heard about Mother Gray from students at the college, so we took a cab and went directly to her apartment, 2436 South Dearborn Street. This was the place where most of the students stopped every summer when they went north to find work. She was a mother to all of them. It was said that she knew more college students than any other person in Chicago. I recall that first thing I did after we secured room was to write Dad, giving him my new address, and to Dr. Owen, asking him to forward all my mail to my new address. We retired early that night. The next morning, Clarence and I started looking for work. So Mother Gray told us where to look. Go to Cool Stot's restaurant over at 2346 Michigan Boulevard. It's right here. And make an application for a dinner job. I'm sure you can get one. So he has different experiences, some of them successful, some of them unsuccessful. And he gets this job. A.H., one of his friends, put me into the master's dining room to break me in. This is at the Hyde Park Hotel. He knew I was green as a gourd at waiting tables in a big hotel dining room. Here I could wait upon the officers and executives until I caught on. But I'd been there not more than 3 days when they came in for dinner, a mighty rush of guests and patrons. This was unexpected. Alex was caught short-handed, and in his excitement called me into the main dining room to take orders. He directed me to a table where sat 5 distinguished people, among them a man older than the others, who looked very much like college people. Timidly and with many misgivings, I approached the table. I started with the elderly gentleman. I attempted to take his full order and the others at the same time. I noticed that he looked up at me inquiringly, but said nothing. Into the kitchen I went, rather awkwardly, I'm sure, to give my orders to the cooks. There were 2 of them. As I entered, about 6 waiters had preceded me. There they stood, twirling their trays dexterously above their heads, cracking jokes and carrying on a running conversation. I became so excited that I almost forgot my own name. I did not remember a single order. I went to the door and looked for my cousin, but I didn't see him. There was nothing for me to do but go back to the table. I approached it with humility, apologizing to the senior member of the company, and told him I'd have to take their orders again. He looked fatherly, but the others were snickering. He glanced at them reprovingly and proceeded to give me his order again. Then he said to me in a fatherly voice, "Take one order at a time." With his kindly help, I finally got through. Before leaving, the elderly man tarried at the table and beckoned to me. I approached somewhat reassured. He put a bill in my hand and said as he was leaving, "I want you to serve me every time I eat here." He said it with such conviction that I'm sure he meant it. He returned 3 times when the summer was over. On the very next trip to the hotel, he said, "I'm Dr. William Rainey Harper, president of the University of Chicago. And you're a student, I know. I've been around them all my adult life." I told him I was a student and gave the name of the school I was attending. I added that it was from the Indian Territory. That fact seemed to intrigue him, And he asked me a few more questions, especially about the Indians. So we came to Chicago in 1900. And then I moved here with my family in 1964. And I was telling Joyce that things were very different in Chicago then. Midway Airport had a trailer, no fixed buildings. And I'd love to go see my father off at the airport there because there was a pot of coffee and a box of donuts, and you helped yourself. So Midway has changed. If any of you have been to Midway recently, it doesn't look like that anymore. So you have to understand that my father and mother grew up during segregation with very limited opportunities. And they could almost only go to historically black colleges and universities. The other schools were not really open yet. So my father so he goes to Fisk, he gets his master's and PhD at Harvard, but his research is on the free Negro in North Carolina. And he has to come to North Carolina in the 1930s to do his research. So he arrives in Raleigh in 1937 and goes to the State Archives. They have never anticipated having a black researcher in this public facility. So they say, we're not ready to receive you. Can you come back next week? My father says, I'm a graduate student. I'm here to use these primary materials. So they compromise and they say, come back in 3 days. So he comes back in 3 days, and they usher him to a small office, which he refers to as a closet, a table, a chair, a wastebasket, a pencil, and a cart, and a key to the stacks, because they're not going to have white staff fetch materials for a black man. So Dad takes the key and the cart and wheels it through the reading room. All the white researchers stop in their tracks and look at him. They wonder what is happening here. He goes to the door of the stacks, opens the key, pushes his cart in, and emerges a few minutes later with his cart piled up with all the materials he needs. And he wheels them back through the reading room. White researchers stop again. He goes to his office and continues to work. He returns the next day, and the archivists say, we have to retrieve your key and your cart. The white researchers have complained that you have unfair advantage. Now, he has to do this across the South, encountering different experiences with different facilities. Now, think if your dissertation research depended on you gaining access to public institutions, public archives, state archives. When he worked at the Library of Congress, there were only 2 places in Washington he could eat: the Methodist Building and Congress. All other restaurants around the Library of Congress were for whites only. And C. Van Woodward said to him, I don't know if I could be a Negro researcher. So someone has asked me permission to use my father's papers and quote from that section of his autobiography as he interviews other researchers from that era. How could they do their work when they had such difficulty accessing primary materials? Now, how did I learn all of this? I travel. And these are examples of a couple of the places I've been working on this museum and working at the Smithsonian. This is from the Museum of the Portuguese Language in Sao Paulo. The museum traces what happens to Portuguese as it evolves in Europe, and then what happens when the language arrives in the Americas. and has to first adopt the names that Indians have given to the plants and trees and lakes and forests and everything that's natural in Brazil, the foods. Then they begin bringing in the Africans from different parts of Africa at different era. And this is the section of the timeline that looks at people coming from the Benin area and where they go into Brazil in 1700. This is where they're going in the 19th century. And so you have Yoruba, Fon, Ewe, words inserted into the Portuguese language. And this timeline is 300 feet long, but it starts in the 1500s and goes up to the present. And there's a European timeline, an American timeline, an African timeline in parallel. And then it shows you the artifacts represented by the words introduced into the Portuguese language. This is the Afro-Brazilian Museum, also in Sao Paulo, which doesn't have a slave ship, but this is the tender that takes you from the slave ship to the mainland. And they depict in this space what the Middle Passage was like and what the arrival in Brazil was like. This is an example of Yoruba gele de art and gele de expressions that enter the Portuguese language. One of the major French cities involved in the slave trade is Nantes. Nantes had 1,700 slave expeditions. These cities become wealthy through the slave trade. And Marc AERA, the mayor of Nantes, the former mayor of Nantes, creates a memorial along the river where the slave ships are built that opened in 2012. That's where I was the day of the Malian coup. And they have the word freedom in every language that they could find. And they build it. You see those homes in the distance? Those are the homes that belong to the French slave traders, and their families still reside in these homes. And how appropriate that the memorial be on the river below their homes. The inauguration date, as you see here, is March 12, 2012. And embedded in the floor are all the points of destination and embarkation from Africa and the places that people went to in the Americas. That's Island of Gorée, where I used to live. This is the crowd on that opening day. And then we marched from the memorial across the bridge leading to the Palace of Justice, and they dropped rose petals into the river representing the lost lives during the slave trade. This is in Richmond. Under the VCU parking lot are the remnants of Lumpkin's Jail, one of the 100 slave pens in Richmond, planning a museum on this site. This is how it was set up. That's the river that they came in on, and there are markers along the river into the downtown area indicating the points of importance to the Richmond slave trail. Gabriel Prosser's executed in the gallows next to the slave burial ground. This is in Florida, in St. Petersburg, a slave cemetery, unmarked graves. To the slaves buried in Oak Lawn Cemetery, in peace sleep on God's hands, each broken heart will mend. This is in London at the British Museum. Sir Hans Sloane, whose collection found the basis of the collection, collected a drum, which you see on the far right, in Virginia in the 1730s. He married a Jamaican sugar heiress and goes to Jamaica in the 1680s and 1690s, and has an artist draw all the instruments that the Africans were using in Jamaica at that time. And he collects this drum, assuming that it's an American Indian drum, but it's actually an Akan drum from Ghana that has survived in the United States. And so Each month, the British Museum takes out a single object and creates an exhibition around it, explaining how this drum was used in the slave trade to exercise the Africans on the ship, and how rare it is to find that drum from that era in the Americas, because all the colonial powers recognized that Africans could communicate with drums, and so drums were considered weapons. Who built the Capitol? And slave labor was a lot of it, and the barracks were where now the Air and Space Museum is located. White House, built by slave labor. This is on Lafayette Square. This is Dunbarton House on H Street. It faces the Chamber of Commerce, and that long white building are the slave quarters, right less than 1,000 feet from the White House. In Alexandria, Virginia, are the offices of Franklin and Armfield, who were deeply involved in the internal slave trade, taking Africans from the mid-Atlantic area around Florida to the lands opening to the west. This is a sculpture to the enslaved people in Zanzibar, in Tanzania. This is in Martinique. This is a sculpture representing the people who went down in a shipwreck. And this is Empress Josephine's, the ruins of Empress Josephine's sugar plantation. These are renderings at an early stage of what people thought, what our designers thought the interior of the museum would be. The slave cabin that you saw is not the slave cabin they envisaged. That's the Contemplative Court and the view of the monument. Now, as I mentioned, the issues that we're looking at here are not unique to the United States. When I meet people from Central and South America, I ask, is the African story part of your national narrative? Is it reflected in your curriculum? Is it in the textbooks? Is it reflected in your museums? So we're working with a whole network of people who are trying to make the history of their countries whole and complete. Who are we currently consulting with? Well, the Kay Brownlee Museum in Paris wanted to do a conference on the archaeology of slavery. The hottest topic in archaeology now is the archaeology of slavery, be it ruins of maroon communities in the Indian Ocean, looking at the archaeological sites in Louisiana, looking at the impact of taking millions of people out of Africa. Indeed, we had a report from a Brazilian archaeologist. You've heard of all of this work being done to prepare both for the World Cup and the Olympics. Well, that's how they discovered the original slave port in Rio de Janeiro, which is now a shrine to the millions of people who came into Brazil. Peru has 2 Afro-Peruvian museums, and we're in consultation with them to help them with their training and their interpretation of slavery in Peru. Danish curators and historians came and visited us month before last because, as I mentioned, the Danes had slave ships, they had castles in Ghana, and the Virgin Islands were Danish. So all of the records that people in the Virgin Islands need to access about their history are in Denmark and in Danish. Similarly, if you were doing research on Louisiana, the archives are in France. Florida, the archives are in Spanish. So that's how language is associated with your theme. Brazilian Minister of Culture came to meet with us because her current responsibility is building the new National Afro-Brazilian Museum in Brasilia. So we're in consultations with them. And the Omanis. Now, Oman is in near Yemen. But the Sultan of Oman controlled the East African trade from Zanzibar. And you can't use the word slavery in Oman, so I don't know how they're going to tell the history of Oman and the slave trade without using the word. But they came to see us. There are implications for your organization. I'll let you really think of them, but a few that came to mind are you need to know your history and the history of the other communities of students you teach. You need to visit sites of importance across the United States. You need to see if the museums in your community or at your university need your help as educators. Because our education team is extremely sophisticated in learning processes and therefore how we will engage visitors of all ages. In the same way that our scholars inform our exhibitions, your scholarship needs to inform how museums educate their audiences. Consider museums as places for your interns. I've been working particularly with historically black colleges, faculty, and administrators to explain that while we need subject specialists, depending on the museum, whether historians or artists or scientists, museums are more than the subject matter, and they're becoming increasingly sophisticated. So that to become a conservator now, whether it's metal or photography or textiles, you really need a PhD in chemistry. We have the materials that we acquire, we have to determine if they are authentically what they say they are. I was explaining to Joyce last night that in Charleston, they taxed slave owners in the 1820s and 30s. And the slaves that you had, that you hired out for skilled work in the city of Charleston, had to wear these diamond-shaped slave badges with the year that you paid the taxes, the name of the specialty of this enslaved person, and the license number. Well, they're extremely rare, and now there's a black market in fake slave badges. There's a black market in fake shackles. Because they're so rare, people are taking the time to try to reproduce artificial ones. So before we bring something in the Smithsonian, we have to make sure that it's really a 19th century, whatever it's supposed to be. The Smithsonian is a billion-dollar industry. So we need people to track every part of the finance. We need educators. We need people in digitization, social media, administration, facility services. So the institution and all museums take interns in all of these fields. So just don't think of us as a group of archaeologists. Now, before I close, I attended a conference last week in Richmond called Healing History. There were people from all over the world, and there was a subgroup of us working on museums, memory, and slavery. And on a Skype call, we had people from Cape Town, The Hague, Curacao, Washington, Ontario. And we realized that most of us had a shared Dutch colonial past. And in the 1600s, the Dutch were bringing people from Malaysia to South Africa, from West Africa to South Africa, from Southeast Africa to New York, and to the Netherlands. So we have this Dutch slave history in common. And the people enslaved are both Asian and African. And the so-called Cape-colored community in Bokat are the descendants of these enslaved people from 1600, who are a mixture of Malaysian and South African and West African people. So our histories are extremely complicated. And at one of the sessions that looked at mass incarceration, and there was a policeman, there was a former policeman that trains policemen in the issues of rapport, developing rapport with the community. And then there were two women who advised inmates and their families on the inmates' rights. My wife turned to me and she posed this question: who is teaching the police trainers, and the trainers of other first responders about slavery, its aftermath, and the use of prisons to keep runaway slaves, people opposed to slavery, and people opposed to segregation? Who's training the trainers? And I'd like to end with my video, please.
The National Museum of African American History and Culture. I just love to say that.
I'm particularly proud of the museum's vision, which is dedicated not simply to this building, but also to reaching out to communities around the nation.
We must tell the story, the whole story, 400-year story of African American contribution to this nation's history from slavery to the present, without anger or apology.
We not only have a responsibility, we have an obligation to ensure that the history and the culture, the contributions that African Americans have made, that voice is heard in the chapters of history.
It's not just about African Americans, it's about how we all change, because African Americans were part of who we all are.
America was built on struggle, was built on dreams, was built on innovation, was built on creativity, and was built on diversity.
When our children look at Harriet Tubman's shawl, or Nat Turner's Bible, or the plane flown by Tuskegee Airmen, I don't want them to be seen as figures somehow larger than life. I want them to see how ordinary Americans could do extraordinary things.
A friend of mine called, and his grandmother is turning 100 years old this year. She also operated a hat shop in Philadelphia for about 70 years. That hat shop's going to be incorporated in the museum, and I'm so excited for her and to tell her that we're going to be a part of the museum.
Our hope for the future of the museum is to walk through with my family and to see people from different cultures speaking many different languages who've all come to the museum to learn more about the history of African Americans.
The most important thing that will happen when you go through this museum is you'll be changed.
Targeting my gift to Lonnie's effort to reach out to the rest of the country and frankly to the rest of the world seemed to be the right way for my family's gift to have the enduring impact we wanted to see.
It really speaks to the uniqueness of America. The hope, the struggles, the dreams, but very importantly, it gives us hope.
Thank you.